Newsreels rolled across American television screens in January 1973. Soldiers stepping off planes, wives running across the tarmac, banners reading, "Welcome home." The nation exhaled. The war, everyone was told, was over. 14 months later, in the highlands of northern Laos, the jungle went silent at War 30, not gradually, all at once. Cade Holloway lay flat against wet limestone, watching a tree line that had been full of bird song 90 seconds earlier and was now full of nothing. Beside him, 11 Hmong fighters from the special guerrilla units did not move. They had learned what the silence meant before Holloway had. 200 meters below, in the dark, a Pathet Lao patrol was moving toward a position that officially did not exist, defended by an American who officially was not there. Holloway had worn a green beret once, not anymore. In 1974, he carried no rank, no dog tags with his real name, no uniform that could be traced back to Washington, just a rifle, a radio tuned to a frequency no one in the Pentagon was listening to, and a promise he'd made to men who trusted him more than his own government ever had. By the time this story ends, you'll understand why the United States government spent decades denying men like Holloway ever set foot in that jungle, and why some of them are still waiting for someone to say their name out loud. The wind shifted. Somewhere below, a boot broke a branch, and Cade Holloway realized the patrol already knew exactly where he was. To understand what Cade Holloway was doing on a limestone ridge in Laos with no uniform and no name, you have to go back 6 years to a version of him that still officially existed. He grew up in Beaumont, Texas, the son of a refinery machinist who taught him to shoot at 9 and to keep his mouth shut about things that mattered even earlier than that. He enlisted in 1966, made it through Special Forces training at Fort Bragg by 1968, and by early 1969, he was one of the men nobody in his hometown knew anything about. Assigned to Command and Control North, MACV-SOG, running cross-border reconnaissance out of Da Nang into Laos along the Ho Chi Minh Trail under the code name Prairie Fire. 3 Americans and 9 Montagnard or Nung fighters dropped into terrain the United States government insisted in every public statement that American forces did not operate in. His file from those years is still in large part classified. His decorations, when they exist at all, are attributed to actions inside South Vietnam that never happened the way the paperwork says they did. That was the arrangement. That was always the arrangement. Men who could disappear cleanly, because officially they were never anywhere to begin with. Would you have signed up for a war your own government would later swear you were never part of? Holloway did, 3 times, on 3 separate tours, each one renewed without asking a single question about what came after. Then, on April 30th, 1972, it ended. Not the war, SAOG. The unit was deactivated, folded into an administrative shell called Stat 138, and men like Holloway were quietly discharged, thanked in a room with no windows, and sent home to a country already exhausted by a war it wanted to forget it had asked them to fight. His DD-214 listed a duty station that had nothing to do with where he'd actually spent 3 years of his life. Home lasted 11 weeks, a man Holloway had never officially met, in a hotel bar in Bangkok, asked if he'd like to keep working. Not for the Army, not for anyone who could be named in a Senate hearing, for an airline, Air America, the largest civilian air fleet in the world at the time, and in practice, the primary logistics arm of the Central Intelligence Agency's paramilitary operation in Laos, the largest covert operation the agency had ever run. No enlistment paperwork, no rank, a civilian contract, a false name on the manifest, and a salary paid through a Bangkok bank account that no congressional committee would ever see. Holloway said yes before the man finished the sentence. The operation he joined had a face the American public had almost never seen. General Vang Pao, commander of the Hmong Special Guerrilla Units, a man who had been fighting communist forces in the highlands of Laos since long before most Americans could find the country on a map. His men, teenage boys, farmers, grandfathers, had been carrying the weight of a war Washington didn't want to admit it was funding, out of a hidden mountain base called Long Tieng that appeared on no commercial map, one of the busiest airstrips on Earth at the height of the war, and invisible to anyone back home. American case officers there used aliases. Supplies moved through channels with no paper trail back to the United States Treasury. Everything about the place was built to not exist. But here's what the official record from 1973 doesn't say. In June of that year, Congress passed the Case Church Amendment, cutting off funding for any U.S. combat activity in Indochina after August 15th. On paper, that meant the war was over. Completely, permanently, by law. In practice, it meant men like Holloway were still on the ground, still armed, still responsible for the lives of the Hmong fighters beside them, working for an agency that now had to fund the operation through channels even further removed from anything Congress could trace. The men on the ridge didn't get a memo announcing their war had legally ceased to exist. They just noticed the resupply flights got thinner, the air support got slower to answer, and the silence on the other end of the radio got longer every month. By April 1974, a coalition government had been sworn in Vientiane. Pathet Lao ministers sitting across the table from the men they'd been trying to kill for a decade. All of it wrapped in a ceasefire the world was told was holding. It wasn't. Not up here. Not where Vang Pao's men still stood, between the Pathet Lao and villages that had bet everything on the American promise that someone would still be there when it mattered. That's the ridge Holloway was lying on in the dark, 14 months after his government declared the war over. Below him, the Pathet Lao patrol wasn't just hunting a Hmong resistance position. It was testing whether the ceasefire the world believed in still meant anything at all, and whether anyone left in that jungle would still be there to answer for what happened next. The order came in over a radio frequency that changed every 48 hours, from a voice Holloway had never seen a face attached to. The agency called it a customer requirement. What it meant was simple. A Hmong resettlement camp 14 kilometers north, roughly 4,000 civilians, mostly women, children, and men too old to carry a rifle, needed an evacuation corridor held open for 6 days while Air America ran them out by air, one overloaded Pilatus Porter at a time. Bong Pao had already committed 2 special guerrilla unit companies to the effort. Holloway's team, 11 Hmong fighters and 1 American who technically worked for an airline, was being sent to hold the eastern approach, the one route the planners believed the Pathet Lao would try to cut first. 6 days. No promise of air support beyond what happened to be available that particular afternoon, because under the Case Church Amendment, American combat aircraft weren't supposed to be flying strike missions over Laos anymore. What air cover existed came from the Royal Lao Air Force's aging T-28 Trojans, flown by pilots, stretched across a country that was falling apart faster than anyone in Washington wanted to admit publicly. Some days, the Trojans came. Some days, they didn't. Grounded by fuel shortages, nobody back home had to explain to anyone. Was this still America's war to fight? Or had it quietly become someone else's problem? Wearing an American case officer's face, Holloway made a decision that would follow him for the rest of his life, though he didn't know that yet. Standard-issue American weapons were becoming harder to justify moving through supply channels that officially didn't exist for a war that officially had ended. So the team armed itself the way most of the paramilitary irregulars in Laos did by 1974, with unmarked weapons bought through black market channels running out of Udorn, Thailand. Swedish Carl Gustaf submachine guns with no serial numbers anyone could trace. Ammunition crates stripped of any stencil that could identify a country of origin. If Holloway went down on that ridge, there would be nothing on his body or his weapon that connected him to the United States government. That was, quietly, the entire point of how the operation was built. They moved into position on the second day, digging in along a tree line that gave them sight lines down into the valley the Pathet Lao patrol would need to cross to reach the resettlement camp's flank. Fields of fire were cleared by hand at night, so the work wouldn't be seen from the valley floor. Holloway checked each position twice, not because he didn't trust the men beside him, but because he'd learned a long time ago that the difference between a 6-day mission and a 1-day mission usually came down to details nobody thought mattered until they did. The tension built the way it always did before something broke. Patrols probing closer each night, radio chatter from the other side growing bolder, less careful about being heard, as if the Pathet Lao no longer felt any need to hide their approach. On the 4th night, Holloway's radio man picked up North Vietnamese-advised Pathet Lao units, moving heavier weapons into position less than 2 kilometers away. Recoilless rifles, possibly mortars, far more firepower than a routine probe would ever need to justify. If you found this channel, we share something in common, a belief that these stories are too important to be forgotten. Every video here is built from declassified records and first-hand accounts, and this one comes from an operation the United States government spent 30 years refusing to officially acknowledge. Subscribe and join a community that honors these men the right way, whether Washington ever did or not. Holloway radioed Bangkok that night, requesting confirmation of emergency air support if the position was overrun. The answer took 6 hours to arrive, routed through 3 relay stations to protect the identity of everyone involved in sending it. It read, "Support contingent on asset availability." No aircraft were guaranteed, no promise was made. Just a phrase engineered, deliberately, to mean nothing if anyone ever had to explain it under oath in front of a congressional committee. He didn't tell the Hmong fighters beside him what the message actually said. There wasn't a version of the truth that would have helped them dig in any harder than they already were. And he'd learned that some kinds of honesty only made men afraid without making them safer. By the fifth night, the tree line below had gone quiet in a way that told Holloway everything he needed to know. The Pathet Lao weren't retreating. They were finishing their preparations, and somewhere behind them, in an office in Bangkok or Langley or Washington, the men who had sent Holloway here were finishing paperwork that would never mention his name at all. It started with a single flare, green, arcing low over the far tree line at Euro 203 on the sixth night. Not a signal meant for Holloway's team, but for the Pathet Lao units massing behind it, telling them the last friendly patrol had cleared the valley floor. 90 seconds later, the recoilless rifle fire started. The first round landed short, throwing dirt and shattered bamboo across the forward Hmong position. The second didn't. Holloway watched a section of the tree line where two of his fighters had been dug in simply cease to exist in a column of orange light, and in that instant, 6 days of careful planning collapsed into something with no plan left in it at all. Automatic fire opened up along the entire ridge a heartbeat later, muzzle flashes stitching the tree line from 3 separate angles, not one. What the official record never says, because there is no official record, is that the assault came from 3 directions at once, meaning the Pathet Lao had known Holloway's exact position for at least 2 days before they moved. Someone had talked, or someone had been watched, or the operation had simply never been as invisible as everyone had convinced themselves it needed to be. Command lines meant to protect the men on the ground had instead told the enemy exactly where to find them. Would you have called for the air support you knew, deep down, wasn't coming? Holloway called anyway. Static answered him for 11 seconds before a voice, young, American, terrified, in a way that told Holloway this wasn't a man who'd done this before, said the words that would define everything that came after. Negative on fast movers, negative on Trojans. Weather's grounded everyone north of the river. You're on your own down there. You're on your own down there. Not from an enemy radio. From his own side, the Hmong fighters beside him didn't need a translation to understand what had just happened on the radio. They'd understood it for years in a language older than the one Holloway spoke. The specific, practiced silence of promises that dissolve exactly when they're needed most. And still, not one of them moved from the line. Not one of them looked at Holloway like a man who had failed them. They simply reloaded and kept their eyes on the tree line because retreat meant the resettlement camp behind them would fall within the hour. And there was no version of that outcome any of them were prepared to accept, whatever the radio in Bangkok had just decided about them. The line held for the first assault, barely, at a cost Holloway wouldn't be able to count until the shooting stopped. It would not hold for the second, and the second was already coming, faster than anyone had time to prepare for. The second assault came in under mortar cover, and this was the moment nobody on that ridge, American or Hmong, would ever fully leave behind. Holloway felt the first fragment before he heard the round that carried it, a hot line drawn across his left forearm that he wouldn't fully register as a wound for another 20 minutes, because there wasn't time to register it as anything except a problem to work around. Beside him, a 19-year-old Hmong fighter named Chong, the youngest man on the ridge, the one who still laughed at things even out here, took a round through the shoulder and kept firing anyway, because stopping wasn't a decision any of them had the luxury of making. What happened next took less than 4 minutes. It would take Holloway the rest of his life to stop measuring time by it. The Pathet Lao pushed hardest at the center of the line, where 2 of Holloway's fighters had been killed in the opening barrage, leaving a gap that a trained eye could see from 200 meters away. Holloway moved to close it himself, dragging a wounded man behind a fallen log while returning fire with a Carl Gustaf that had no serial number and, technically, no owner. Every round he fired came from a supply chain built specifically so that no one back home would ever be able to prove any of this had happened at all. Who do you think was supposed to answer for what was happening on that ridge? And did any of them ever have to? Radio traffic from Bangkok had gone completely silent by this point, not because anyone had given up, but because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't have been a lie. Holloway stopped calling. There was a particular kind of clarity in that, in finally understanding that whatever happened next on that hillside was going to be decided entirely by the men actually on it, and by no one else, regardless of what anyone in an air-conditioned office 300 miles away had promised weeks earlier. The center held because Chong held it, bleeding, refusing to be moved to the rear even after a second wound opened along his ribs. Beside him, an older fighter named Pao Yang, a father of 5 back in a resettlement camp Holloway had never visited, fired until his weapon jammed, cleared it by feel in the dark without ever taking his eyes off the tree line, and kept firing. These were not soldiers in any sense the United States government would ever formally recognize. They were men who had bet their family's survival on a promise made by people who were, at that exact moment, 300 miles away, deciding whether the promise was still worth keeping. At the 20-minute mark, ammunition became the deciding factor it always eventually becomes in a fight like this one. Holloway's team was down to roughly a third of what they'd started the night with, and the Pathet Lao showed no sign of running out of anything. He made the calculation every commander on a collapsing line eventually has to make. Not whether they could win, but how long they could make the enemy believe they still might, because that illusion was the only thing standing between the position and the camp behind it. He would think about that moment for the rest of his life. The exact second he stopped counting rounds and started counting minutes instead, because minutes were the only currency left that mattered. The Army called what happened on ridges like this a victory when the line held and a tragedy when it didn't. The men on the ridge itself never used either word. They used numbers. How many rounds left? How many men still able to fire? How many minutes until first light might finally bring help that had no legal obligation to come at all? And then, from the southeast, a sound none of them had heard in 6 days cut through the gunfire. A low, mechanical drone, growing louder against every rule anyone in Washington had ever written down on paper. It was a Pilatus Porter, unarmed, unarmored, painted in the plain gray and white of a civilian air carrier, Air America, flown by a pilot who had no combat authorization, no clearance from Bangkok, and no intention of waiting for either. His name in the informal, half-documented history that survives of that operation was known to the men on the ground simply as Tuck. What he did next was never in any after-action report, because there was no after-action report. But the men who were there remembered it for the rest of their lives. He brought the Porter down through mortar-lit darkness onto a stretch of ridge, barely longer than the aircraft itself, close enough to the fighting that Pathet Lao tracer fire chewed through the tree line less than 60 meters from where he touched down. He wasn't there to fight. He was there because Air America's unofficial code, passed pilot to pilot with no paperwork attached, held that if a customer's team was still alive and calling, you went and got them, regardless of what Bangkok had or hadn't authorized on the radio an hour earlier. Was it the mission that changed, or just the men willing to break the rules to finish it? Holloway got Chong and 2 other wounded fighters aboard in under 90 seconds, while the remaining line held its position under covering fire. Every round now counted individually because there weren't enough left to waste. The Porter lifted off overloaded, clipping treetops on climb-out, carrying more weight than its manual technically allowed, flown by a man who would never receive a medal for what he'd just done, because officially, none of it could be acknowledged as having happened. It wasn't reinforcements. It wasn't air support in any sense the Pentagon would have recognized. It was one unarmed civilian aircraft and one pilot who decided the rules written 300 miles away didn't apply to what was happening on that ridge. But it was enough. Enough to pull the wounded clear. Enough to convince the Pathet Lao commander below, watching an unmarked aircraft descend into contact without hesitation, that reinforcements might be arriving after all. The assault slowed, then it stopped. By 05:30, as gray light began separating the tree line from the sky, the Pathet Lao pulled back into the jungle the same way they had come, quietly, deliberately, unwilling to commit further against a position that had just demonstrated it could still call in help nobody back home had promised. Holloway would learn much later that Tuck's flight that night was never logged as a combat sortie. It appears in surviving records, when it appears at all, as a routine cargo run. The men whose lives it saved knew otherwise. So did every pilot who flew for Air America in those final years. Men who understood, long before Washington admitted it publicly, that the difference between a war that had ended and a war still being fought came down entirely to who was still willing to show up for it. The Eastern approach held. The resettlement camp's evacuation corridor, the entire reason 11 men had spent 6 days digging into that ridge, stayed open for the 2 remaining days it needed to. Nearly 3,900 Hmong civilians moved through it by the time the operation was declared complete. Women, children, and elders who would never know the names of the men who bled to keep that route open because those names had never officially existed to begin with. Holloway didn't leave the ridge with the wounded. he stayed with the 6 fighters who could still walk, covering the final withdrawal of the camp's last families, watching from the tree line as the last overloaded porter of the evacuation lifted off 2 days later, silhouetted against a sky the color of old brass. There was no ceremony for what they'd done. There wasn't going to be one. In the paperwork that existed at all, the ridge action of that week would be folded into a single line describing irregular contact, no U.S. casualties reported, a sentence written by someone who had never set foot within 100 miles of that hillside, and who would never know it wasn't entirely true. The cost of 6 days on that ridge came due slowly, the way it always does once the adrenaline runs out and the counting begins. 3 Hmong fighters died in the defense of the eastern approach, men whose names appear nowhere in any American record because the operation that employed them never formally existed. Their families received no notification, no benefits, no folded flag. What they received, when word eventually reached the resettlement camp weeks later, was simply the knowledge that the men had died holding a line so that thousands of others could walk out alive, a fact that meant everything to the people who loved them and nothing to a government 7,000 miles away that had already legally declared the war over. Chong survived. He would carry 2 scars from that night, the wound through his shoulder and a smaller one along his ribs that never fully closed the way the others did. He was 19. He would spend the following year recovering in a resettlement camp that itself would not exist as a place of refuge for very much longer. Would you have told his family what it actually cost to keep that corridor open? Or would silence have felt like the kinder option? Holloway's wound closed within weeks. The deeper injury took longer. He filed no report with any American agency describing what had happened on the ridge, because there was no form designed to receive it. His employer, an airline on paper, issued him a new assignment 11 days later, as though the previous one had simply concluded on schedule. In a very real sense, for the purposes of any record that would survive, it had. 6 days of combat, 3 men dead, a resupply corridor held open under fire against orders that promised nothing and delivered less. All of it compressed eventually into a single unremarkable line in a logistics summary that used the word delay instead of the word battle. Tuck, the pilot who had landed a civilian aircraft into an active firefight to pull the wounded clear, continued flying for Air America for another year before the operation wound down entirely. He never spoke publicly about that night. Very few of the men who lived through operations like it ever did. Not because they had nothing to say, but because for decades there was no framework in which the country that sent them was prepared to listen. What the ridge cost in the end wasn't only measured in the dead. It was measured in every man who came down from it changed, carrying an experience his own government would spend the next several decades declining to officially acknowledge ever took place, fighting a war it had already told its own citizens in writing was finished. By the fall of 1974, the political ground beneath the entire operation was shifting faster than anyone on that ridge could have predicted. The coalition government in Vientiane was fracturing in slow motion, Pathet Lao political cadres were moving into towns and villages across the country without firing a shot, absorbing territory the ceasefire had technically frozen but never actually protected. Vang Pao's special guerrilla units, once numbering in the tens of thousands, were being asked to hold ground with steadily thinner support, funded through channels that grew more improvised and more deniable with every passing month. Holloway understood, by the time he shipped out on his next assignment, that the ridge hadn't been an aberration. It had been a preview, a small, mostly unrecorded demonstration of exactly what the remaining months of the secret war in Laos were going to look like for the men still fighting it. Alone, unacknowledged, and running out of time faster than anyone back home was willing to admit. In May of 1975, Long Tieng, the mountain base that had never officially existed, the largest covert operation the CIA had ever run, was evacuated for the final time. Vang Pao boarded one of the last aircraft out. Thousands of Hmong who had spent a decade fighting a war on America's behalf were left to face the Pathet Lao's advance without the country that had recruited them ever formally acknowledging, in that moment or for years afterward, that the alliance had existed at all. Holloway was on one of the last resupply flights out of the region before the base fell, 3 weeks before his 30th birthday. He carried no medals because none had ever been authorized for actions no government would confirm had taken place. He carried no official commendation for the 6 days on that ridge, because the operation it belonged to had never been assigned a case number that survived. What he carried instead was the weight of every name that would never appear on a wall, in a report, or in a headline. Men and women who had trusted a promise made by a country that ultimately treated the promise as expendable the moment it became politically inconvenient to keep. The war Washington told America had ended in 1973 didn't end for men like Holloway until Long Tieng fell 2 years later. And even then, it didn't end so much as it simply stopped being anyone's official responsibility to acknowledge. What changed the war in Laos wasn't a treaty or a ceasefire signed in a conference room. It was the moment the men actually fighting it finally understood that the country they'd trusted to remember them had never fully intended to. Chong made it out. So did Pao Yang. Tuck flew his last covert sortie out of Long Tieng the same week the base fell. Still unlisted, still officially a cargo pilot for a civilian airline until the day the airline itself ceased to exist. Most of the men who fought alongside Holloway on that ridge scattered afterward. Some to refugee camps in Thailand. Some eventually resettled in the United States decades later, under programs that never once used the word veteran to describe what they had actually been. Holloway came home to a Texas that had no framework for what he'd actually done, because officially he'd spent those years working for an airline. There was no parade for that. There was no explanation he was permitted to give his own family, no form of acknowledgement his country was prepared to offer a man who had spent 3 years fighting on its behalf in a war it insisted, on paper, had already ended. There was only a man, quietly older than his years, carrying a war that history books would spend decades writing as though it had finished before he ever fought it at all.